So, Guy, I've been really excited to talk to you today. This conversation has, in my mind, been coming up through the past year. I've had a lot of conversations with L&D leaders on the Video Learning Lab podcast. I think one topic keeps coming up, and I was waiting to think, when should I reach out to the Guy Wallace, to talk to him about this? And it's this idea of what's next for L&D. By that I mean we have a legacy of training. It's been hard to define L&D for business leaders in the organization. And then there's this new age. 2023 is the age of large language models and AI, which don't necessarily speak to these systemic problems that we've had in L&D. But I thought this is it's all part of people trying to L&D folks trying to redefine what the role looks like for themselves, but also trying to predict what's going to be valuable. How should we talk about these skills for the business? So, Guy, welcome. I'm excited to have you on today.
Thank you, Kevin, for having me.
We'll take it. So the goal for today, and I thought that I know you wouldn't shy away from a challenge, is our goal for today is to figure out, one, what's next for the L&D position, and what are the skills gaps that we want to, skills gaps or mindsets we want to address. And ultimately, I will think that this episode is a win if I can get you to say what we might call the evolution of L&D. What's the next for the position? Do we rebrand it, reform it, or something completely different? And then the million-dollar question is, what might you call this new title? How does that sound?
Yeah, that's fine. This is an age-old issue, though, but so we'll be revisiting, my distant past as we talk about the future.
We will take it. So the three areas that I think that we had discussed before jumping on this recording is three key areas that we want to use to frame this conversation before we take that big leap at the end. One is the idea of building in a performance mindset, which I've been following you. I've read all your things. I know that's what you're about. We'll be talking a little bit about bringing a business mindset, which is a slight pivot there. And then, of course, you are known as the guy for, the guy and Guy for performance analysis as a skill. So I'm curious, can you kick us off? Can you take us a little bit through, what is performance mindset? Why is performance critical for L&D?
Well, so in an enterprise context, enterprise L&D versus educational L&D, because there's a difference there. In the education world, you learn things, and the people that constructed the learning or delivered the learning don't know necessarily how you're going to apply it, what work processes or workflows that you might have to contend with when you apply what you've learned. But in an enterprise learning and development context, we most often, not always, but most often we can define that work process, that workflow, in terms of what are the tasks that the learner needs to be able to perform back on the job, what are the outputs that they are to produce, and what are the stakeholder measures for both tasks and outputs, so that we can get a good outcome versus a bad outcome. It's one thing to produce an output that meets the downstream customer's requirements, but has violated the regulatory requirements, because that's not necessarily a good outcome. That's a bad one. So you're trying to meet all of the stakeholders' requirements, and we're trying to develop individuals' performance competence, the processes performance competence, the organization's performance competence, the value chain's performance competence. And by performance competence, I mean the ability to perform tasks to produce output to stakeholder requirements. So at all levels, that definition works, and that's the goal. So if you're not, if your mindset is that, we're in learning and development, and so we produce learning, well, that's one mindset. The other mindset, which is age old, goes back into the 60s, is we are to help people and their organizations perform better, faster, and cheaper, borrowing some language from the quality movement, who might have called it quality, quantity, and cost. And so there's many organizations, if you will, that are aimed at improving performance, and we have our role to play in that, which is helping people with their knowledge and skill deficits and addressing that gap so that they get what they need when they need it, if they need it, to
Mhm.
help them become performance competent.
I'm curious. So you're, that concept of outcomes over versus outputs. I know that the complaints that I hear is that a lot of folks are, are stuck in the output world where, they get a request for training or they get a request for a course. I think that's one of the problems that we all recognize. I think before we go into how do we fix it, I guess how did we get here? Because you know, this idea of requesting courses and trainings, it wasn't always, it feels like it's always been this way. And are we just waking up to it now in the current L&D landscape as we're trying to prove things, or is there some precedent to that?
I think we're caught in one of these endless cycles where, because when I got into this field in 1979, the gurus at the time that I was lucky enough to be made aware of, they were complaining about our focus on education versus training, that we were there to produce content versus produce, competent people. And so this has been going on and on for a long time. There's always been a small subset of the field who had a performance orientation, understood that learning or instruction or training or education is but a means to the ends. So you have to look at this situationally in its context. What are we trying to actually ultimately produce? And but too often we get focused on the means and don't have a clue about the ends. Now, the late Tom Gilbert wrote about this in his 1978 classic book, Human Competence. And he bemoaned the cult of behaviors because back in the 70s, too many people were focused on behaviors, but they didn't. But behaviors are situational. Sometimes you want to be and I don't know if this translates here internationally, but sometimes you need to be a good cop and sometimes you need to be a bad cop. Sometimes you need to be open and empathetic. Sometimes you need to be listening and hearing what everybody is saying. But there's other times when you say, do this and do this now, because the building's on fire and we don't want to die. So let's get out of here. So there's a time and a place for the variances in behaviors. And so, but his point was that if we don't understand the results, which to him he called accomplishments and his business partner back in the 70s called outputs, they lead to outcomes. Now, I had an argument with the people at Ford Motor Company back in the early 90s because they were all about job number one, and those were outcomes. But you can't practice producing outcomes, but you can practice producing outputs that lead to
Mhm.
good outcomes. And
Mhm.
too often when people talk about outputs versus outcomes, it's not just outputs, it's outputs and how can you tell a good one from a bad one? What are the measures? Whose measures are they? And if there's conflict in with your stakeholders about how to measure an output, somebody's got to win and somebody's got to
Mhm.
lose.
Yes.
And I wrote an article for a quality journal back in the mid 90s about this because one of my clients was running around going, the customer is king, the customer is king. I'm sorry, if the government of the where you're operating says here are the laws, regulations, and codes that you must comply with, otherwise we're going to fine you and throw people in jail. I don't care what the customer demands. If they want you to
Yes.
violate the law, you shouldn't do it. So the customer is not king. And so we have to take a systems view of what we're addressing and look at, from a learning and development standpoint, we're producing uh, things that enable people to learn knowledge, skills, behaviors, competencies, but we have to understand the context of where that plays out. And in an educational realm, the instructor, teacher, professor might look out at his audience and say, each and every one of you, 40 people, has a different application for this.
Mhm.
That makes it very tough to address, to get down to the performance requirements. But in an education, and too often that's translated into corporate training or corporate learning, where we provide generic content. It may be good, but we don't go that last mile in how to apply it. in your
Mhm.
workflow, in your work processes to produce your outputs.
Mhm.
And that, so we too often, our learning leaders and our clients and the practitioners all too often have an educational mindset versus a training mindset. Now, that language, education and training, has always been an issue. And what does it mean? And is it overlapped? And, is one subset of the other? And so, as somebody who's been in this business for 44 years now, I don't think that those issues are ever going to go away. And we all have to contend with them. And the new people coming into the field have a more difficult climb up the learning and performance curves because of our language and how inconsistent we are all about all of that.
I think something interesting that you mentioned is, that education mindset versus a that performance mindset is that I think fundamentally, whether you were, whether you were whether you were delivering training 40 years ago or today, you're at the end of the day, you're still trying to shorten that gap, close that gap between information and the problems that people are trying to solve, and that performance on what people are trying to solve. And it seems like the main approach became this training mindset, which I think is also reflective of the classroom and lecture style. And somehow that became something that was able, maybe it's easier to produce that. And so we were looking at the solution here without looking at the total system. Was there a particular moment when that broke down? Was there a change in language? I guess what made us stick with this information educational side without an eye towards actually putting that information into action or transferring that?
Well, so the language differences are between education and training. Now, those are both types of instruction, if you will. So, but the late Bob Mager, who was a huge guru back in the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s, he at an NSPI conference, which is now ISPI nowadays, back in the mid 80s, I believe it was 85, he stood up in front
Sorry,
of the
what's
conference.
ISPI? Sorry, I'm bad with that.
ISPI is the International Society for Performance Improvement.
Got
I've been a member of this since September of 79, 1 month after I got into the field. And this is where the gurus who had the most influence over me, this is the organization that they all belong to.
it. Mm.
But Bob Mager stood up in front of an audience at a keynote and said, "Why are we arguing about education versus training? As if we don't understand the differences between them." And he said, imagine your daughter goes off to college and writes home, because this was the 80s, writes home and says that she's taking a sex education course, or she writes home and says she's taking a sex training course. Well, the audience
Yes.
erupted. And he said, "See, you already know the difference between education and
Mm.
training." So education gives you awareness, knowledge, and skills. Um, but training takes that awareness, knowledge, and skills and builds on top of that and teaches you specifically how to apply it.
Mm.
Now, depending on what that application is, and the learner and what they already know about it or don't know about it, sometimes we don't have to go very far. Sometimes we can just educate them and they'll be able to perform
Mm.
because it's a familiar thing, and the what we're giving them is it adds to their prior knowledge, what they have already learned from education and work experiences. And so
Mm. Mhm.
that's a variance in our target audiences in terms of what do they need. Well, somebody with the same job title, you and I, if we had the same job title, we may have different jobs. The
Mhm.
job title, it doesn't tell us that you may have different outputs that you're producing. You're worried about the finances of the product management effort, and I'm worried about the engineering and technical aspects of it. And that's what our bosses divided and divvied it up that way. So your knowledge and skill requirements vary from mine, even with the same job title. And some of the things that others like you who were looking at the finance, some people come in the door knowing things already from prior education and experience. And so there's things that they need to know to be able to do their jobs that they already know. You might come in fresh and not know any of that and need it all. So we're always dealing with variances in the performance requirements of our learners and the variances in what they need uh, because of what their job requires and what they already know. And so
Mm,
we can, this is that whole issue of personalizing training.
yes.
Well, first we need to performanceize it, in my view, and then we need to modularize it, chunk it, so that people can get only what they need when they need it. And
Yes.
that's the trick of us is to determine that whether we're doing it on the upfront side of before design and development, whether you call that analysis or discovery. Those are the things that we need to understand and clarify and get sign off with our clients and stakeholders that that's what we're all aiming for. That's the terminal performance and situation and the variances within. And these are the target audiences and the variances within. And therefore, this is how we need to construct, architect, engineer, whatever, the learning. And if we can avoid training with job aids, because when we look at the performance, we can should be able to determine whether or not Guy the learner needs to have that committed to memory. So when he's confronted with needing to do that in the performance context, he has it at the ready in memory.
Mm-hmm.
Or, and my experience suggests that most of the time, Guy could look it up. He could
Yes.
look at a reference, a job aid, performance support, whatever, this is part of our language issue. Those are called many different things, but not everything needs to be committed to memory. And I was lucky on my first day on the job, I was given things that suggested to me that we didn't need to have the learner commit everything to memory. We can give them guidance, which was from a 1970 newsletter article, but in 79, it was already being called job aids. We can give them a job aid and guide their performance. They don't have to memorize that. They may have to memorize where to find the job aid because back in the late 70s and early 80s, we didn't have all this digital technology that I could get my phone out and look and find it and then follow it. Um, and so, but so these are the differences. This is, but if you come in this with an educational mindset, it's I've got to give you content. And more content seems to be better than less content, which is not true at all. We need to find a way to slim down our content, whether that's in a job aid or a training course or resources and courses, as Nick
Mm-hmm.
Shackleton Jones talks about them. We need to just give the learner, who is really a performer, the essential content, and we need to extract all the extraneous content because of cognitive load, and we can load the learner up with too much and then they can't really learn much. So we need to skinny all that down um, to help them learn to perform. And the
And
test for all of that is not some quiz or knowledge test. It's actually performing the task to produce the outputs and meeting the stakeholder measurements so that you can be somewhat predictive of the outcomes once they get back to the job.
and just to tie it all back to what you said before about it's about performance. It's not about the size of the output. It's not the type of the output. It's or what you're using to help drive performance. It's really focusing on the total picture of what leads to that performance outcome, and then what are the tools that you can use, and the shortest, slimmest, most uh, I keep going like this with my hands. I'm scooping out the
Easily
sides.
accessible.
Yes,
So
that is
what,
what easily
don't ask
accessible.
me
Yes,
to read something if I'm on
exactly,
the top of a telephone pole in the sleet and rain, because I'm not going to be able to
exactly,
do that. So maybe I should have
exactly,
memorized that, or maybe I need an ear bug to tell me, to direct me that way. So we always have to
exactly.
look at that performance context and that variances to decide what's the way to give that in the moment of need or before the moment of need when we're preparing people, because they have to have that at the ready memorized. And so how do we do that, and what's kind of spaced learning do we use to keep that evergreen, ever present in Guy's mind, so that something that he had learned and proven it, he didn't forget in the meantime before he needs it.
Uh, as you were talking, I was just thinking about that poor person who's up on top of the telephone pole in the rain, and if they were to receive, continue to go on and receive training like we do, we hand out trainings today. They're, maybe 2 days before they were sitting in a classroom taking a quiz, and now they're on top of the telephone pole in the rain, and that knowledge is completely unapplicable. Um,
Ideally, we
mhm.
would have put them through some sort of a virtual reality
There we
simulation
go.
of
Yes.
being up there in the, and making the room extra cold because, it's sleeting or
And
whatever.
somebody
But those,
throwing rain at them. Yes.
yeah. And I mean, so we might have started off in the classroom where it was, warm and dry, but then we at
Yes.
some point got them there so that they would know how to contend with the realities, with the authentic performance that they're going to face. Uh,
Exactly.
but so these are age-old challenges, and the technology that is ever evolving.
Yes.
It gives us so much more advantages and affordances that we should be able to do that if the cost benefit is there.
Well, you've teed up the next topic that I want to talk to you about, which is about bringing the business mindset to L&D. What is the cost benefit? What is the ROI of our initiatives? This is something that comes up time and time again, where a lot of L&D teams are missing on delivering value because they're not speaking the same language as the business on, hey, this training is not, even if it's all digital, is not free to produce. It takes time to develop the training. It takes time to pull people away from desk and deliver training. And so that idea of business mindset or ROI, I have playfully put in funding, who's funding our project. It's something that
Yeah.
a lot of L&D folks are missing. And so again, why are we missing this? What's the root of this problem? Why we're missing this business mindset in L&D?
I think because many who are in L&D, regardless of the route that they took to get there, because there's many varied routes to the L&D world, we don't have a business mindset. We don't know how score is kept in business. We don't know that there are, revenues that come in, there are expenses, and at the end there's a pre-tax profit, and taxes are taken out, and then there's profits, and those are plowed back into the business or distributed to the shareholders or whatever. We are too often clueless about that. And so one of the things that I learned it was in speaking to the language of my customers and clients was that not everybody in my client world spoke like a CFO, a chief financial officer, or somebody with a financial background. I've dealt with a lot of people who came out of manufacturing or engineering, and they kind of spoke a quality language. So one of the things that I had done, I had been working with a defense contractor where they build military fighter aircraft, and they had switched from having draftsmen at drafting tables, making blueprints and handing that off to manufacturing, and they had switched to a CAD CAM system, computer aided design and computer aided manufacturing, which meant you were working at a computer terminal instead of a drafting table. And people were struggling with this, and they were producing bad designs, and those would be made, tooling would be made, and parts would be made, and those parts would fail. And so it was a giant mess. Well, I had done this curriculum architecture design, producing a learning and development path, saying, here's what everybody needs. Here's what you've already got. Here are the gaps. Prioritize the gaps and build or buy this content that you would need to help people, become performant competent. Well, we led off the meeting with 20 some people in the room by saying, showing them this. And the inevitable first question is, what's this going to cost? And my client said, well, we've estimated it to be $2 million. And the room went crazy because they hated the sound of that thing. And so I went up to their whiteboard at the front of the room and said, there's 100 people in the audience, right? And put 100 on there. I said, what's the fully loaded salary of this? And they had to argue back and forth because it varied. And so we settled on $60,000 a year. This was the early 90s. And so 100 people times 60,000, you can do the math and figure out that's what you're paying for these people to perform. So what level of proficiency are they at? Now, it's obvious they're not at 100, but are they at 75% proficiency? Oh, no. 50? No. 25? No. And they argued about whether it was 25 or 15 or 20 or, it was that. So I said, let's just give everybody the benefit of the doubt and call it 25%. So you're getting 25% of your dollar, and you can do the math here and figure out are you leaving on the table every year. And that was a huge number. And that made the $2 million look like a pittance. And so they all changed their mind. Now, what I had done is I had called these things not the investment cost, 2 million, and the return, which was the delta between what they were getting. I was using quality terms from the late Philip Crosby these are things I learned in the early 80s. And the cost of nonconformance. This is the cost of the problem. You're not conforming to the standard or requirements or whatever, and this is costing you what? Cost of nonconformance. That's the return in ROI. So the cost of conformance is what's it going to cost to fix that? Well, that's the I in ROI, the investment cost. And so if you said, I'm going to spend $2 million and solve a $6 million problem the first year, and so I get a net gain of $4 million the first year, and every year after that, I'm $6 million to the good, or something like that. Now, these were engineers and manufacturing executives and managers, and so they were able to go, okay, ballparking these numbers here, they were good enough. And all of a sudden, the conversation shifted from how soon can you have this done? They didn't care about the cost. So I learned a valuable lesson to lead with, what's this worth? What's this problem or opportunity worth? And establish and get the room or the client and stakeholders to come to some sort of agreement on, what is that approximately? And then when we talk about what's it going to take to address that, well, then it's a different story altogether, because we're using ROI or the quality terms for the equivalent to help them establish what's the value of what we're addressing. And, sometimes the clients are well aware of that. Sometimes they don't have a clue. Sometimes we're dealing with a requester who's a middleman. They don't know. They've just been told to come and ask us to do this thing. And so we can clarify their request, but they can't give us any details behind that because they don't know. So eventually we have to get to people who really understand, why do you want to do this and why now? And so what's really at stake? Are these high stake issues? Are these medium stake? Are these low stake? And by stakes, I mean risks and or rewards. Because
Yes.
if the risk is, well, the government's going to come in here and shut us down next month if we don't get this squared away, well, that's a huge high stake. And so, let's get on it and be real quick about it, and understand that there's a deadline that's not arbitrary, because too often deadlines are arbitrary. So part of this is that getting that business mindset is looking at this as a business executive, a leader, somebody who understands, I make these investments. I got 10 places to invest money. I'm going to invest in these 3 because they got the biggest return. And that helps us meet our strategic goals and our tactical issues of the day. So, but we in learning and development, and many of the people that I've had on my staff in past companies, did not know how to think about those kinds of things. So business acumen is a key and critical skill. And I would tell people, you can't really play any game successfully unless you know how score is kept. Then once you understand how score is kept, we can talk about the rules and how to play and do this thing. And always in the back of your mind, I'm trying to score or keep the other people from scoring. So we really need to understand in learning and development how our clients keep score. And if we're to develop content to help a certain group of people, hopefully we're focused on what are their performance requirements and how is performance scored and kept back at the ranch, back on the job for
Yes.
them.
Yes. 2 things that you pulled out to pull out there that I think are so critical. One is this idea of finding the right people to get the information you need to make your case. Because I think often the first or second person that I get for to kick off a project, they might be a champion, but they don't have all the information. And
Right.
therefore, if they don't have the information, I don't have the information, I can't make a case. The second thing that you mentioned there is, I think when, maybe it's my own bias, but when I think of ROI, I'm thinking about more so about the opportunity, where it's, if you give us this money, we will turn this into, you will make these gains with us. Because I think that's a very clear way of thinking about, for me to think about an investment. Put money in, get more money out.
Yeah.
But what you said there, I think that is critical, is looking at the cost of, framing your case in the cost of, what's the cost of doing nothing? What are the consequences of not addressing this problem? And what I like about that, I forget, it was $100 million or $1 million that was written up on the board. You know, that's a number that, it's almost, the scale of it is almost too big to understand what to do with that number. Everybody can recognize that as a large sum of money, but we all don't know what that means individually in the scale of the business. So by breaking, but that also served as the common language that you were able to use. You didn't use training language or learning design. You said, let's break down this cost in the common language we understand. And by then we can establish a common business case for what is the consequence of not getting this right, or what is the consequence or risk of us doing nothing and it look like a pittance.
And it's important to, this is another, you know, one of the many sneaky tricks that we need to learn and employ is, even if you know what the numbers are, ask the question, because if it comes from you, it means one thing, it's suspicious. If it comes from them, that's valid and credible. You know, a guy may have valid data, but is it credible? We don't know. He's a consultant, you know. So that's one of the things that I would do, is that I would say, hey, I've got these numbers from the people that you pointed me to. I've gone out and interviewed them or whatever. But let's see what you think about it, how your numbers would compare to theirs. And that's a challenge, and executives, you know, and the stakeholders, they all rise to that challenge because their egos demand it. And so they would give me their numbers, and then I would say, well, here's what your people have said. So either that's close or it's not. And then we can talk about, you know, if there's differences, you know, why is that and who's right? But really, it's about getting this is similar to one of the things I learned back in the early 80s from Neil Rackham, who wrote the Spin Selling book, one of the most popular book in the sales world. But SPIN is an acronym. It stands for, you know, what's the situation, and then what's the problem or opportunity, and then what's the implications, big deal or no big deal, and then what's the needs to be paid off. So that needs to be paid off, that you're Socratically leading the group or the client through that process to get to something. Here's something that needs to be paid off. This is worth $10 million a year. We can solve it for $150,000, which, you know, $150,000 in isolation might sound like a lot, but not compared to $10 million a year. Then it's, you know, clear the decks, get out of my way, and let's get going with this. And so that's the issue, is that the data has to be valid, and it has to be credible, because I've had valid data thrown across the room in a binder because my sources were not deemed credible. Now, when I was sent back to go do it all over again with the right people, this was back in '81 at Motorola, I came back with the same data, but it was credible because it came from credible sources.
And I can't help but think about early in the conversation, this idea that our job is not to provide advice or a solution. In these conversations, it's to facilitate the understanding of information. I think but by that, I mean, in that example you just shared, sometimes you're sitting with a stakeholder, you have this, you're doing discovery, identifying the key problem. Some of the information they might not have that you need to bring them to is, hey, this is what your employees are saying versus what you just said. And again, it's about bringing people close to that information so that they can then act upon it or make a decision about it. It's not you being prescriptive, it's you facilitating the flow of information, so that maybe this is actually thinking about the difference between knowledge and training. It's sometimes you need to make sure you're on the same page about the knowledge before you implement implement, you put
Yeah.
that into action. So, I think you've just really led us into, I think, that third piece that I really wanted to cover today. That is a huge skills gap, is this idea of performance analysis, but really, how do you guide conversations with stakeholders? And so I feel like you've really laid out already two techniques here. One is being outcomes driven from the start. Another technique that you've laid out here is how do you frame a business case? How do you frame a business case in terms that you all commonly understand? And so I am giving you the warning that we are coming to that big question that I want you to answer. But what are other Guy Wallace tricks or techniques? Like, what is a critical question or technique that you can use during performance analysis to either, go back to building that critical skill, finding that critical skill, or identifying that process? Is there anything, do you have a go-to question that we could all start implementing tomorrow?
Well, I think that it really starts with the request. When you get a request, I had learned, and then it was reinforced, not to challenge that request, but to clarify it. And most often that request is to give people things to know, and not, what the result is, the terminal performance. So we start in the middle instead of the end. We begin with the means. People need to know this, but why? So you can ask, but why? But that seems a bit challenging. So I learned a long, long time ago, and I'm not sure where I got this from. I'm sure I got it from somebody, but I learned to segue as quickly as possible, but not too soon, to asking, so what would authentic practice with feedback look like? And the requester might, it might be clear cut. They may not know, but they would know, oh yeah, that would be something he would need to know, which means maybe he does need to go do some of this analysis, or call it discovery, because analysis paralysis is what they're thinking. And so if we begin, and I begin my design with what's the practice, I begin my development with what's the test, and then what's the practice before that. So I'm always focused on something that reflects the real authentic work that people need to do back on the job after the learning. And so segueing to getting a client who's stuck in, they got to know this, they got to know that, they got to know this, they got to know that. You can't, you got to worry about people's egos, and make it safe for them when you ask, so what would practice look like? And then you can get into the conversation where, well, Guy, that's everybody's got a different application, so practice would be different if you want to really have it be authentic. Oh, okay. Well, that's a challenge, because if we just give them information and don't go that last mile, so to speak, on how to apply this in an authentic manner, it's not going to transfer. So they may like it, they may master it, it won't transfer, and then you won't get any good positive impact. And that causes them to pause and to think, oh yeah, so maybe I do want people to actually, this to he's using this like transfer and then have impact. So then it comes a question of, well, maybe the same content needs different application exercises or different practice and feedback, because your job is different than mine, and how you apply it is different than me. And so you apply spreadsheets and use spreadsheets differently than I do. And teaching us about spreadsheets only goes so far. So what would practice be? Well, Kevin needs different practice exercise than Guy does. So now we can talk about how we modularize that. Is that feasible? Because if you're trying to scale generic content education, well, that's doable. But scaling training that's performance-based and is going to help people do something differently, be able to do something that meets the requirements back on the job, that's different and harder to scale. And way too often, our clients, our L&D leaders, the practitioners, we're all about, we'll trade off effectiveness for efficiency, because that's too costly to do a different practice exercise for every last person. That's too much. Well, I've had training sessions before. This was easier in a kind of a classroom, and even in virtual deployments, to have the learners get the generic content. And now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to create practice exercises that reflect exactly what we're going to do back on the job. So here I am as a learner learning something, and now I got to create my own practice exercise and you're creating a different one, but at least it's something for us to practice on so that we can get a feel for what's that like to apply that. Then we can
Yes.
debrief and say, is that going to be easy or difficult when you get back to the job?
Yeah.
What are the barriers to you successfully transferring this in? Is it going to be your supervisor, your coworkers, your customers? What? Who? And how do we contend? How are you going to contend with that? Let's develop strategies and tactics so that you can be successful in transferring what you've learned back to the job and making it stick so that we can get the positive impact we're hoping for.
I'm too excited, so I'm jumping in. But what I really like about this question and this idea of introducing authentic practice and feedback into the conversation at this stage is
Early.
one, it expands the expectations for people development. People need time to try things out, make mistakes, get feedback, and so you're already thinking, designing with transfer in mind. There's something about it where you're also you're extending their thinking beyond. I can't say no to you asking me to deliver a training because you are who you are, and that's the solution.
Oh yeah, we're support organizations. We're there to support people, not to reject their requests, depending
Exactly.
on what our processes are, but we are there to, support the business. So we can help the client help themselves by asking a couple of questions. And the earlier we do this, the better. Because then if we say, well, we got to have some analysis to understand that what that authentic performance really is and all the variances that we need to prepare people for, because isn't that part of it? Or is this rote performance where it's the same time every time all day long?
Yes.
And so they can talk about those things, and we can help them by Socratically asking the right questions, open their minds to what's possible here. Then we
Yes.
can talk about, whether it's got the cost benefits to do this, because if we're trying to solve a nickel problem with a dollar solution, that doesn't fly, because, if we do it that often enough, we'll bankrupt the place.
And the last thing I wanted to add on top of that question, just building off of that in terms of expanding expanding the methods that you might use to lead to performance. I like this idea where if you're talking about authentic practice and feedback, it's not just the employee who's going to be developed, and it's not just there's also the managers who are giving the feedback, or that you could what I'm trying to say is you could surface problems that might expand the scope of the conversation, but that also is something that the champion should know who's trying to get this problem kicked up off the ground.
Yeah, because one of the I think the biggest barriers to transfer is management back at the ranch, back on the job. If you taught me some newfangled way to do something and my supervisor doesn't know that, they can't manage me because now I'm doing something they don't understand. So I had a client, Eli Lilly, back in the early or mid 90s, who insisted that every training package produced for the learners had a management supervisory piece too, because they were on that learning curve now as well. They had to learn this newfangled thing from a management supervisory perspective. And then that would begin to ease that barrier away, because managers no longer resisted. But it could be the coworkers as well who says, Guy, you're on the team here, you're doing something new and different, we don't understand it, we don't get it, do it the old way, because that we understand that. And so that's one of the things that the analysis has to uncover. Now, I used to ask my clients in my very first meeting. I had formal project steering team meetings in my projects, and I would worry about transfer out loud early. And a lot of them were, why are you worried about that now? And later on, when we got closer to actually transferring it, they go, yeah, we get why you were bringing that up now, because we've been thinking about that. Is it the supervisor? Is it the coworkers? Is it the downstream customer? Is it who it could be, stopping it from happening, which meant then all of our investment, time and energy and money was for naught. We just wasted all of that because we didn't think about the receiving system for
Yes.
that new learner going back to the job, and what could stop them. And it's not all the time would there be something to stop them, but often enough so that too much training, too much learning that learners master is for naught because they can't use it back on the job. And and there's a lot of people who say that that's training, learning, development's responsibility for transfer. No, it's not. It's the client. They own the
Exactly.
people out there. They own that environment. So I would tell my clients, you need to demand it. You need to inspect for it. You need to reinforce it and provide consequences to make it happen and to extinguish the inappropriate behaviors of the people out there who are trying to become the barriers to transfer. And so you need to let the organization know we're making this change. There's a new way to do this thing. And Guy has learned this and, help him out. Here's a package for you. Here's some communications for you people. So, yeah, we expect them to do it this new way. And we need to think about this from systems thinking perspective, is that we're not teaching Guy something. He's learned it. He's mastered it. And then we don't care. No, we've got to think about this. Because if we're dealing with high stakes performance, again, what's the cost of nonconformance? What's the lost opportunity cost? When we train Guy, he goes back out there, they extinguish that, he never applies it. We don't get the benefits out of that.
Yep.
These are huge issues, and these were issues in the 70s and probably back in the 60s, and we're still contending with the same darn things.
We've covered a lot, and now we're down to our big key question that we want to answer. So we're going to put you on the spot. So if L&D is going to, what's next for the L&D position? Is it rebrand? Should we reform the team? Or is it something completely different if we want to address these three key areas?
Well, my thinking on this, this was on the cover of a book that I wrote back in 2011.
All right.
Earn the name change and then change the name. So if we were to rebrand and call ourselves something different, because I remember after 1990 and Peter Senge's book, The Fifth Discipline, came out, talking about the learning organization, all of my corporate clients, all in the Fortune 50 and 100, changed the name from training and development to learning and development or something along those lines. So we made the shift from training to learning, because training was often not training, it was education, but called training and didn't really change anything. So we did a name change, but didn't change our philosophies, our processes, our practices. And so we're in the same sad place in that we're developing learning, but we're not having the positive impact. We're not giving the organization the return, the benefits of the costs. And so the book was about performance improvement consulting. And that was a phrase that I was using because the phrase performance consulting, which usually meant looking at all the variables of performance, because it's the process itself, it's the data and information, it's the tools and equipment, it's the consequences, were not being looked at, but people were beginning to talk about performance consulting in place of performance-based instruction or training or learning. So too many performance consultants aren't performance consultants. They're performance-based instruction or training or learning consultants, because their solution is always going to be a learning product. And true performance consultants, which is why I'm changed it back then over 10 years ago to performance improvement consulting, was because I had to differentiate it, because we while we're doing analysis or discovery, we're in the ideal place to look and to see what's really causing the gap. Now, if it's new hires, yeah, they're the gap. Okay, they don't know. That's understandable. But if we're trying to address a performance problem or opportunity, and the client thinks that learning is going to solve that, we need to really look at the performance itself and the context to determine maybe learning and development products are not going to be sufficient at actually impacting that problem or opportunity. And therefore, we're going to develop a bad reputation because they threw learning at it, but that didn't work. And so we need to come back at the end of analysis. This is the topic of, one of my most recent books here is the pivot point. At the end of analysis, when we're reviewing our data with the clients and talking about what we're going to do in design, we can share with them the data that might suggest to them that they shouldn't even do learning, or that they should do learning but do some other things as well. Because perhaps the gap is it's a faulty process. Perhaps all the top performers, the master performers, told us there's a process, but we don't follow it because if we did, we would be unsuccessful. So I never follow the process, but all the new people coming in, they're taught the process or told by their managers to follow the process, and so they do. And that's why you got so learning isn't going to be, it's fixing the process first and then fixing the learning to reflect the new, correct, better process. Or it could be that the tools, or a classic is the late Gary Rumley used to say, the first thing I look at is the process. Is there one? If there is, are people adhering to it? If not, why not? The second thing he says is we give the performers, the learners, the benefit of the doubt. We look at the consequence system. Perhaps people who are good get more work than anybody else. And they eventually figure that out and they start slacking off. So we have performance that's deteriorating. and so maybe it's not a knowledge and skill at the root of a problem or opportunity. It could be these other variables. And we as analysts or discovery people, whatever they're called, when we go out there and begin to look at this, we need to quickly, because we don't want to be caught up in analysis paralysis, we need to understand quickly what are the performance requirements, what outputs are to be produced, and how do you know a good from a bad one? What are the behavioral and cognitive tasks that need to be performed? And do people already know some of that, all of it, none of it, what? And then we can construct something. But if we determine that we have gaps in outputs, not because of knowledge and skills, but because of lousy process, lousy data, lousy tools, and a consequence system that's out of balance, well, then those things need to be addressed, and learning is not going to do anything. So the name change, this is tricky. I would have liked to called it performance enablement, but the quality people might take exception to that because that's what they're doing too, using different language. So we are really, if we stay in our lane, we are there to help address knowledge and skill deficits through one means or another, learning or resources, performance support instead of memorization methods. And so I don't know that I don't have a really great answer, and I have been thinking about this for a while before you asked even. But so I would have called it performance improvement consulting, because that's what I'm trying to do to help the client. And if that gives me an opportunity to develop learning content for them in support of performance improvement, then that's fine. If what I've helped uncover is that they don't need that at all, they need to do other things, I'm still doing my job. We just stopped the learning and development project because it's not needed. And we've saved the organization a bunch of time, money, and given them the opportunity to use that time, that money on other issues. And so we're doing good work. It's like if you go take your car into the car mechanic and somebody has told you need to replace your engine, and they say no, you just need to replace this and that, at 5% of that cost. That's good. I mean, so that's still a car mechanic, but they maybe didn't do car mechanical stuff. They just did something else. And so we've got to be business champions first, learning champions second, and business champions third. We need to surround ourselves with this mindset of being business champions, and if and when it's appropriate, becoming the learning and development champions that can do stellar instruction, both performance guides and training as necessary to the situation.
I love it. I think that so we're going with performance improvement consulting. I think what it does is it has an eye towards performance, which we talked about, improvement, which is always good for the business, but also consulting. I think it opens up the space that we don't have now to conduct the analysis. The expectation is not that we're going to conduct the analysis that we actually need. So Guy, I can't thank you enough for your time. You took some risks here. I can't thank you for sharing your stories and pulling through. It was such a pleasure to have you. Thanks for coming on.
Kevin, thanks for inviting me.